Hello, my name is David Baer, and I'm the stated clerk of the Presbytery of Southern New England. Welcome to this worship service, which is offered to your congregation as a gift from the Presbytery of Southern New England. These worship services are designed to be flexible enough to allow your congregation to fit them in where needed, to allow your pastor or worship leader to be able to take a break and to continue online worship during this time of COVID-19. Our preachers for these worship services come to us from around the larger church, and our focus for these services is to continue our learnings on anti-racism and equity, as this is a ministry focus of the Presbytery. Today our worship leader is the Reverend Larissa Kwong Abazia, who is a member of the Presbytery of Monmouth in New Jersey. She currently serves in interim ministry and congregational consulting. Larissa served the larger church as the vice moderator of the 221st General Assembly and is on the General Assembly Committee on Representation. Welcome, Larissa, and come, let us worship God. Let us join together in the call to worship. Though we have known hardship and pain, though life has not always turned out as we had hoped, we will stand here and say, God's steadfast love endures forever. Though life becomes more complex, the deepest questions remain unanswered, and the mystery of faith deepens, we will say, God's steadfast love endures forever. And though the pain of the world often seems more than we can bear or address, we will stand firm in our faith and say, God's steadfast love endures forever.
When we face an unknown future that we can't imagine yet, when the closeness we have treasured turns from blessing into a threat, as we miss our friends and loved ones, as we crave community, may we look, God, in this season for a whole new way to be. Jesus feeds the lonely desert as a time to look within. There he met such trial and conflict, there he knew you were with him. In this time of separation, when we miss the life we've known, may we hear your voice proclaiming, I am here, you're not alone. May we cherish those around us as we never have before. May we think much less of profit. May we learn what matters more. May we hear our neighbor's suffering. May we see our neighbor's pain. May we learn new ways of offering life and health and hope again. God, when illness comes to threaten, and when so much here goes wrong, may we know this thing for certain, that your love is sure and strong. You're beside us in our suffering, and when times are surely tough, we may face an unknown future, but it's filled, Lord, with your love.
Our prayer of confession is a portion of the Confession of Belhar, which is the newest confession to be added to our Book of Confessions. The Confession of Belhar is a confession from the Church of the Global South, originating in the Uniting Reformed Church of South Africa. This was the church formed after apartheid. Apartheid formed a racially stratified society. Those with the lightest skin tones were offered the greatest protection and opportunity. Racial separation was established by law and enforced through violence. Non-white citizens lived with constant and intrusive police presence and interference in the daily functions of life. Those who protested risked punishment, imprisonment, and even death. The roots of apartheid go back in South African culture and church for several centuries. The Dutch Reformed Church embodied racial separation when it formed 3 mission churches in the late 19th century, each categorized by its racial identity. The Dutch Reformed Mission Church was formed for people designated as colored or biracial. The church's complicity with racial separation kept Christians from worshiping and coming to the Lord's table together. The white Dutch Reformed Church created an elaborate biblical interpretation and ideology that supported racial separation and then the formal apartheid policies. The Dutch Reformed Church's active participation and theological defense of apartheid moved the global church to name apartheid a status confessionis, a conviction that the gospel was at stake and thus the faith needed to be proclaimed. Leaders of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church wrestled with this situation theologically and practically. One outcome of their struggles was the emergence of the Confession of Belhar in the early 1980s. The Uniting Reformed Church of Southern Africa, the church that succeeded the Dutch Reformed Mission Church after apartheid, has offered the Confession of Belhar to the global Reformed family as a gift, believing that the themes of unity, reconciliation, and justice issue a call from God to the whole church toward holy action, transformation, and life. Let us offer these words as a confession to God. We believe that Christ's work of reconciliation is made manifest in the church as the community of believers who have been reconciled with God and with one another. That unity is, therefore, both a gift and an obligation for the Church of Jesus Christ. That through the working of God's Spirit, it is a binding force, yet simultaneously a reality which must be earnestly pursued and sought, one which the people of God must continually be built up to attain. That this unity must become visible so that the world may believe that separation, enmity, and hatred between people and groups is sin, which Christ has already conquered. And accordingly, that anything which threatens this unity may have no place in the church and must be resisted. Therefore, we reject and confess our complicity in any doctrine which absolutizes either natural diversity or the sinful separation of people in such a way that this absolutization hinders or breaks the visible and active unity of the church, or even leads to the establishment of a separate church formation, which professes that this spiritual unity is truly being maintained in the bond of peace, while believers of the same confession are, in effect, alienated from one another for the sake of diversity and in despair of reconciliation. Have mercy on us, O God. Hear these words of assurance. God's love and mercy know no bounds. Whoever we are, wherever we have been, whatever we have done, know this: you are loved. You are made new in Jesus Christ. In the Spirit we find our true communion and our whole. Go in peace, knowing you are forgiven. Thanks be to God. Amen.
God be in my head and in my understanding. God be in mine eyes and in my looking. God be in my mouth and in my speaking. God be in my heart and in my thinking. God be at my head and at my departing.
Hello, and thank you for the privilege of joining you in worship on this day. I want to say a particular thank you to the whole Presbytery of Southern New England for the courageous way that you've taken on the work of anti-racism. Thank you for dedicating your time to learning, growing, and then challenging and changing systems for the better. Well, our scripture reading today comes from Genesis chapter 47, verses 13 to 26. Hear now these words for us on this day. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money, it's gone." And Joseph answered, "Give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." So Joseph brought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land, it became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you, sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." They said, You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Systems beget oppression, which require survival. Joseph was already the beloved son of his father, wearing a cloak of rich fabric to remind his brothers that he was indeed favored. And yet he still takes every opportunity to share visions that they would bow down to him one day. Honestly, if I were there, I might have hip-checked him into the pit too, if I was walking alongside him on the road. But sold into slavery and then rising to power, Joseph is put in charge of 7 years of plenty through 7 years of scarcity. As Walter Brueggemann suggests, this part of the story is where the world market and its abundance versus scarcity, where it begins. A severe famine in the land with stores of food saved up from the 7 years of plenty, and Joseph charges the people for their own stocked up crops. And the masses, desperate to have nourishment, pay him. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into the Pharaoh's house. Now, I can't help but think that it's possible that Joseph was strategic about taking their money, but not their livestock, because the next year the people return with empty stomachs again. Faced with the demands to feed themselves and their animals, they proclaim that they have no money, but their beasts would be healthy collateral. Joseph takes every single horse, flock, herd, and donkey, almost everything that they own, so that they can eat for just 1 more year. It's no surprise then that the people have to return on year 3, struggling and hungry again, saying, "We cannot hide from my Lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of our cattle are my Lord's. There is nothing left in sight of my Lord but our bodies and our lands." They continue by saying, "Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." These actions, these words are not from those who live under a thoughtful, compassionate leader. These are the words of people pushed in an intentional system of poverty and hunger in the shadow of the stores of grain that proclaim Pharaoh's power. These are the words of people who have nothing left but to sell their own bodies so that they can live another day. Death or slavery. This is Joseph's relief program. And today the options remain the same. Look at Eric Garner strangled as he pleaded for relief, or George Floyd who had the breath crushed out of him after 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The years have gone on between these incidences. The families, though, are still mourning. We need only acknowledge that the choice is either death or enslavement to an unjust system. We say the names of those robbed of their lives: Nina Pop, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Alexa Negron-Luciano, Rashard Brooks, David McAtee. Sadly, the list is long and it's growing. For all of the shootings, murders, and killings that will never make it to the news, and all of the names that will never be collectively said because of it. Now, if you're concerned about the supposed political turn that this sermon has taken, thinking that you might just shut off your video or step away from the live stream, I caution you, friends, not to turn back from the reality of death or slavery. Look at the people of color who have been adversely affected by COVID-19. The high rates of death among Black and Indigenous communities, the high rates of infections within Hispanic and Latinx communities, the violence and hate crimes against Asian Americans, and the extreme invisibility and vulnerability of undocumented immigrants. As voices shout out that protests and demonstrations are too risky and will make more people sick, they respond, if we stay in, we can't breathe. If we go out, we can't breathe. It doesn't make a difference. They have just two choices: death or enslavement in a system that could care less about their lives. Or point out the food swamps, those places where less nutritious food is the norm, while fresh, nutritious meals are a far-off dream, and acknowledge that it's either a slow death or slavery to a market system that's more interested in the bottom line than actually feeding people. You see, if we feed people, and I mean with food, but also spiritually, physically, and emotionally, if we feed people, but do not fix the system that is actually oppressing them, we're living behind the wall of white supremacy. We trick ourselves into thinking that doing the right thing overrides the hard and demanding work of dismantling a system that has been centuries in the making. We'd rather start a program than look at the structure that is fueling the oppression in the first place. You know, though it seems so long ago, the early impact of COVID-19 on congregations was huge. We had to shift from in-person to virtual or pre-recorded worship services. For some of us, this change came over a matter of days. Pastors and church leaders had to discern what this would look like as the technology presented challenges for our regular order of worship. We had to consider whether the familiarity of the sanctuary was important, or if sacred space set up in one's home would be enough to create connection and meaning. And early on, there were debates about communion online. Could it be done? And if so, how could it be done? How could it be done decently and in order? Did our Presbyterian polity cover this holy meal when we find ourselves scattered all across the region, unable to be in the same space? And what should people use for the communion elements themselves? And would it be all right if someone watched a pre-recorded video on their own time and did communion by themselves? It had the potential to become a slippery slope of questions. Yet, in fact, what I have found is that the celebration of the Lord's Supper as we are separated from one another due to COVID-19 has become a significant part of our life together. I find such joy as I preside at the table, looking at the screen and seeing my own congregation lift up what they have from around their homes. I've seen wine in fancy glasses passed down from previous generations of a family. Glasses of orange juice, mimosas, coffee, and water. I've watched as people break double chocolate chip muffins, tortillas, and homemade bread. When our polity says that we encourage people to use elements that are familiar to their context, it cannot get more familiar than what you find in your own pantry. What we once thought was temporary has become a new normal. And while we could have remained bound to a world that didn't regularly use the words pandemic or quarantine in its everyday life, the church chose to modify, adjust, and transform. We looked at the best that the system offers us, and seeing that our people needed to be fed, acknowledged that it required something different in this season. We chose grace and love over binding ourselves to rules and regulations. You know, to be honest, I'm actually not as concerned with Joseph. He perpetuated an imperfect, oppressive human system that exploited his neighbors while securing his own social status. But there will always be unjust rulers out for themselves, even if they are people of faith. See, the thing is, friends, I want to know about the priests. They don't get a shout out until the last third of the passage where it says, only the land of the priests he didn't buy. For the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. So Joseph made a statute according the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. These tax-exempt priests could very well have been in the pocket of Pharaoh, Joseph, and their governmental leadership. After all, no one wants to tax a religious leader if they can offer you a blessing. I confess that we will never know definitively of the priest's action in this period because the text doesn't talk at all about that. But what the text does tell us is that the people come back 3 times with higher and higher payments to sustain their lives, 3 times without any relief from any corner of Egypt or Canaan. I think that the priests could have spoken up on behalf of their neighbors. And if they didn't have enough food for the whole nation, they could have challenged Joseph's extortion of the people. First their money, then their livestock and their land, and then even their flesh and blood. All of that happened right before the priests. Their silence was their complicity in a system that only protected them as they watched the slow destruction of their neighbors. Perhaps it has never been more politically correct to talk about racism and white supremacy. The Ku Klux Klan no longer hide behind their hoods. Space for white supremacist opinions is maintained on the national stage. People of color continue to get beaten in the streets or tear gassed as they march, yet they're still going out at risk of their bodies and lives so that they can simply be seen and heard by those around them. The truth is, these systems have continually been here since the first European colonists landed on North American shores. This dominant culture behavior has become more insidious, and even the church has allowed such sinfulness to continue to live and breathe. Like the priests in Joseph's time, the church has often embraced its internal life, while sacrificing or at the very least ignoring the needs of those around them. This moment right here is centuries in the making. Don't squander it. Don't opt for window dressing rather than the harder, more difficult work of creating a new way. Death or slavery. Lord, have mercy on us. May the church and people of faith finally take a different way.
For the offering today, you are invited to give through your normal channels of giving to your local congregation. If you wish, you may also give to the Presbytery to support our anti-racism and reparation work at www.psne.org/donate. Thank you for worshiping with us. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Let us build a house where love can dwell and all can safely live. A place for saints and children till our hearts learn to forgive. Built of hopes and dreams and visions, rock of faith and vault of grace. Here the love of Christ shall end divisions. All are welcome, all are welcome, all are welcome in this place. Let us build a house where hands will reach beyond the wood and stone, to heal and strengthen, serve and teach, and with the word make known. Leading outcast and the stranger, bear the image of God's face. Let us bring an end to fear and danger. All are welcome, all are welcome, all are welcome in this place. Let us build a house where all thy name their songs and visions heard, and loved and treasured, taught and played as words within the word. Beds of tears and cries and laughter, prayers of faith and songs of praise. Let this house proclaim from floor